Diane and crew for having us here. We're very excited to be here. And thank you all for being here. January 2nd, 2000. Y2K had just happened, and we didn't all explode. Our computers still worked. Y'all remember the fear about Y2K. A guy named Eric was working at the Target store on Ford Road in Dearborn Heights. He had gotten there in the morning, and he was scheduled to stay there until like 5 or 6 o'clock or so in the evening. Well, he told his supervisor that he wasn't really feeling well. Could he go home a little early? And she said, yeah, that's fine, you can go home early. So it was probably about 4:15 when he hopped in his Jeep and he took Ford Road down toward his home in Dearborn Heights as well. It was a pretty short drive. So he got almost all the way home. He was about a block from home, and he pulled over as Ann Arbor Trail goes over the Rouge River near Hines Drive and all that. There's a bridge there, still there. He pulled his Jeep over and parked it south side of the road, just west of the bridge. And he got out of his Jeep, and he walked over the bridge, and he just kind of looked over. Well, meanwhile, across the street and a couple doors down, there was a young man in the driveway of his home, and he was there with his girlfriend, and he was about to drive his girlfriend home. And so they kind of noticed this guy stop his Jeep, but, didn't really think much of it. So they got into the car, and they pulled out of the driveway, and they headed toward where Eric was with his Jeep. So Eric runs out, hey, flags him down, hey, you gotta call 911. There's a woman down there. And they're like, and so the boyfriend, the young man, pulls over, and he gets out. He leaves his girlfriend in the car, just in case what this guy is saying is true. Comes over to the bridge and confirms it. Looks over, there's a woman there in the river. And so he tells his girlfriend to go back to his house and get his dad. So the girlfriend does that, grabs the dad. He comes out, he looks over and sees there's the body of a woman here in the River Rouge. So they call 911. And the police arrive, and they spend that whole evening processing the scene. Now, of course, as part of that, they interview everyone at the scene. Interview the boyfriend, the girlfriend, the dad, and they interview this guy named Eric. Now, Eric claimed that he was driving home and he was feeling sick. And so he pulled over because he was going to throw up. And then he notices this woman. What is this woman doing here? There's a body of a woman here. Well, there was something about Eric's story that just kind of nagged at the Dearborn Heights police. Unlike Detroit, Dearborn Heights does not get quite so many murders, and so they decided they were going to investigate this pretty strenuously, and they interviewed everybody extensively, but they asked Eric to come to the station. You're a witness. Can you come to the station and tell us more about this? Because we really want to hear more and we really want to find out what happened to this woman. They could also tell the woman was wearing like a black leather outfit. She had like a black leather mini skirt and had black stockings, and she was laying on her bum in like a mixture of ice and water. And so this was January in Michigan, so she was just kind of stuck there. She wasn't going anywhere, but it was partially melted, partially ice, partially water. But they could kind of tell by how she was dressed. There was also a shoe lying near her that was one of those, you all might remember, I don't know if they even have them anymore, when you are a bridesmaid at a wedding and you need to buy a pair of shoes that matches your dress, sometimes they dyed them. They had the pumps and they dyed them blue or something for your dress. It was one of those kind of pumps, but it was gold. So they looked at this woman in the river and they kind of made a few assumptions about her. And there was just something about Eric's story that just wasn't making sense. For one thing, Sergeant Mike Petrie, who was working the scene that night, who went on to head the Dearborn Heights Police a few years later as the chief, Sergeant Petrie was thinking, okay, you're driving home from work, and you're almost home, and you pull over there to throw up. Wouldn't you just go home? Are you really? And then you pull over, and you walk over to the bridge, and you don't throw up. That was another thing, he didn't vomit. And if you're looking over and you're seeing a woman in the water, wouldn't that make you throw up even more if you were sick? I mean, honestly. So they really were suspicious about Eric's story. So they took Eric to the station, they interviewed him for about an hour. Eric insisted, I've never seen this woman, I don't know who this woman is, why y'all hassling me this way, I'm just being a good Samaritan, I'm just reporting something I saw, on and on and on, lie after lie after lie. Because Eric had actually left Wendy Jordan there just hours earlier. He picked her up on the streets of Detroit sometime during the night before, and we don't know exactly when that was. She was sighted at a gas station here, a gas station there, and his neighbors on Fairview and Dearborn Heights heard a car starting in the background or in the driveway of the house next door, and so they kind of put some pieces together as to when he may have gone out and picked up Wendy. He took her to the parking lot behind a funeral home, ironically, strangled her. And then, strangely enough, unlike any of his other victims in Detroit, usually when he killed someone, he pushed them out of the Jeep. For some reason with Wendy, she was victim number 2 in Detroit, he carried her in the Jeep almost all the way home. The few miles from Detroit to Dearborn Heights, and he was literally like a block from home when he pulled over and dumped her in the river. So it was a strange aspect of this case of John Eric Armstrong. And Dearborn Heights cops were right. There was something about that guy's story that just didn't make sense. And then eventually, a few months later, after Dearborn Heights had tailed him, stolen the trash at his house, investigated him pretty well, even got search warrants for DNA, and we're pretty sure that they had their killer. They did not realize that at the same time, Detroit police were actually working on the same case. And so, let me know, with that, we're going to segue over my partner in crime, Dr. Gerald Cliff, actually with Detroit police back in the day, worked the case as part of the Violent Crime Task Force, and he can share some of his thoughts about it as well.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
You didn't tell them how you got involved in this.
Yeah, I can get into that after.
Just
Go ahead.
no, but I mean,
Okay.
You're much nicer to listen to than me.
No, I mean.
He has great stories. He has great stories. So many years later, after our January 2nd, 2000, we have a mutual friend who was also a Detroit cop, actually still works part-time for Detroit, doesn't he, Craig? We were talking, and I've always been a fan of the true crime documentaries, the Forensic Files, the Dateline NBCs. Oh, I eat that stuff up. I love that stuff. And it's a very popular genre nowadays. A lot of people are watching it if you turn on Oxygen or ID or any of those kind of stations. And so I was chatting with my friend Greg, who was a Detroit cop, and he was talking about his friend Jerry, who worked a case back in 2000 of a serial killer in Detroit. And I'm like, oh, a serial killer in Detroit, that sounds really good. And he said, yeah, Jerry always thought it would make a good book, but he's just kind of never found the time to write it himself. He's got all these files from the case that he's been carrying around from move to move, and he's like, maybe that's something you would be interested in doing. I've never written true crime. I've written a lot of other stuff in my life, but never true crime. And I mulled it over for quite a while, and it kind of haunted me for a few months, and I thought, I would really love to do a project like that. So Greg introduced us, and then we had a long discussion about the case, and I was hooked. So now Jerry can give you his perspective.
Well, You'll soon see it's very unfortunate that she's handing it off to me because she's a much better public speaker than I am, and a lot nicer to look at. What had happened in November of '99, I had just been promoted into the executive ranks in Detroit, which is a step above lieutenant. They used to call it inspector, now it's captain. And at that rank, you're given command responsibility. I won't go into how exactly I ended up in charge of the violent crime section, but basically the major crimes division of the department was homicide, special investigations, and violent crimes. Violent crimes was kind of new. It had only been around for about 8 or 9 years. And there's a really interesting story about how it came about, but we don't have time for that. Anyway, it was kind of the go-to unit that the chief depended on anytime there was something that homicide either couldn't or didn't have time to handle. And what happened, we were sitting on Mondays, we would have a command meeting, and I would be there as the head of violent crimes. There would be the commanding officer of the homicide division would be there. The commanding officer of the special investigations division would be there, which was everything but homicide. It was the biggest investigative division in the city. And we would all meet with what would be effectively the chief of detectives. We had a different term for it, but that was the function. And we would discuss what was going on investigatively throughout the city, any high-profile homicides, high-profile rapists, serial rapists, because special investigations was sex crimes, child abuse, domestic violence, see if I can remember them all, armed robbery, financial crimes, the ICAC task force, the Internet Crimes Against Children task force, and commercial auto theft. I mean, it was huge. There was over 200 detectives just assigned to the Special Investigations Division. I had about 150 at Violent Crimes because we also had the Repeat Offenders Bureau who went out after warrant absconders, people running from the law, and we had the Crime Analysis Unit, the computer people that mapped crime and analyzed, looking for patterns and clusters and so on and so forth. But anyway, we were all at this meeting on Monday morning, and while Chief of Detectives is taking our individual reports, this is back in the day of pagers, long before smartphones, the homicide commander's phone goes off, or pager goes off. He gets up, excuses himself, goes to the boss's desk, dials his main desk, and his sergeant on the desk tells him, we've got a dead body out at John Crown in Michigan, out by the railroad tracks. It's female. So he comes back, and now, at that level, we're high enough up that we usually don't go to crime scenes. We're managing. He had 75 detectives assigned to homicide. He didn't have to go to those crime scenes. He was in charge of managing all of their investigations and making sure they had the resources necessary. Well, he comes back, sits down, and resumes our meeting. About 10 minutes later, beeper goes off again for him. He gets up, excuses himself, goes to the phone, makes a couple of comments, really, trying not to get into a long conversation in front of the meeting because, the chief of detectives is sitting there talking to the rest of us, and he goes, all right, we'll be there, and he hangs up. He comes back and he says to the boss, he says, we may have to, convene this later. He says, we've got 3 dead bodies out in one location. He says, and I think we're going to have to really mobilize some resources and get out there. So we all go out there, and we find, you'll see some of the crime scene photos in here. They've blurred out certain parts of it, but the photos in the book are the real crime scene photos. I had them on file. We started investigating and realized that all 3 of these women had been killed at different points in time. One was relatively recent. She had been stripped from the waist down. She had been posed. I'll let you read the book. And it was obvious that the killer had spent some time with her, let's put it that way. As the officers on the scene were processing it, the evidence attacks, one of them walked away from the scene, and you got to envision the scene itself. There's a railroad track bed, and then there's a gully off to the side, and that gully is fairly heavily overgrown with brush. He steps away, and I don't know if you included in the book why he stepped away. But anyway, he steps away from the scene to take a break, and he says, "Oh my God, there's another one." And she's been dead for much longer than the first one. And you can tell that she has already begun to decompose. And as he's beginning to relate how he found the second one to the supervisors at the track level, he's backing up and turns around, and there's a third one. And she's been there quite a while, a fairly advanced state of decomposition. But we could tell that there were enough similarities that it was obvious that the same person had murdered all three of them. So, by definition, as set by the FBI, anytime that you have three or more crimes of that nature, whether it be rape or homicide, and they have enough similarities in their method of operation, so on and so forth, that constitutes a serial. Serial homicide in Detroit is as bad as Detroit is personified out there in the media. Fairly rare. The last one that we had, this is in 2000, the last one we had was in 91, and the book will soon be coming out. So a lot of the people present, in spite of the fact that they'd had many years, some of them decades of police investigative expertise, they had never worked a serial homicide case. We've done a lot of serial rapes. Unfortunately, there's an awful lot of that in the city. But a serial homicide was something everybody was relatively new at. I don't think anybody at the scene had ever worked one, because the last serial in the Detroit area was Highland Park. Although we crossed the border a couple of times, but it was predominantly worked by the Highland Park Police Department. So we didn't get involved. So there was not a whole lot of expertise out there, even though you would expect in a major city with a violent crime rate of Detroit that, we would have. So obviously we're all out there, all of the heads of all the major divisions are out there, and obviously the chief of detectives is out there, and he's getting a little interested, a little concerned, because now he's got to tell the chief. Chief has to tell the mayor, and somebody's got to tell the media, okay, because this is big news. So, and I know I'm going to slip. Chief of detectives like to be referred to as Doc. That was just his thing. He was a good guy, really, really good guy, an old-time cop, and that's just the way he liked us to talk to him. So Doc says, "Man, we got to do something about this." He says, "This is something we've got to really marshal our forces. We got to go at it hard, and we got to solve this fast, before it becomes an issue, more of an issue." So from the scene, he gets on the phone to the FBI profilers in D.C. The psychological profiling unit of the FBI specializes in profiling serial crime, serial homicide, serial rapes, and some other things. We've used them in the past for different kinds of cases that we've interacted with them in the year or two that I was at Violent Crimes, and in the subsequent years when I ran special investigations, which they put me there after I was at Violent Crimes after this case. Anyway, the profilers told us, they said, we explained there's tons of evidence, but we've only just fallen onto this scene with all the bodies, within the last hour or so. And they told us from the get-go, they said, "Listen, don't look for his successes. Look for his failures. This guy has tried and failed somewhere along the line. Find somebody, go out there with your surveillance units, canvass the area, and find out if there's these girls were all streetwalkers, sex business. he said, have your investigators go out there and talk to everybody on the street, see whether or not there's been anybody that's been, that somebody has tried to abduct and take to the railroad tracks and assault, and that it's made a getaway. And sure enough, they were right. We found somebody. Well, interestingly enough, as difficult as we expected this thing to be, we had the guy in custody within 41 hours.
Yeah, day and a half.
Day and a half. The boss told us, he said, nobody's going home until we get this guy. And our protocol was, when we get a big case, you investigate it until all the leads are exhausted or somebody's in jail. And that was just the reason, I mean, the way that we worked. And it's the way I was always brought up, the way I was trained in investigative areas. And in fact, the newspapers were kind of making fun of us. They said, yeah, if you happen to be a streetwalker and want to be safe, go to Detroit. You know, what kind of a thing is that for the newspapers to be saying? But, you know, they no accounting for journalism, but their lack of taste. But needless to say, we had the guy within 41 hours, which leads to another amusing story. If anybody remembers Benny Napoleon, he was the Wayne County Sheriff. Well, he was the chief of police at the time. One of the best of the 9 chiefs I ever worked for in my 31 years in Detroit, and I told him so after he retired. He didn't think I was, you know, polishing the apple, so to speak. I waited until he was gone, couldn't do anything, but he had a sense of humor, and he had a way with the media, and the media really liked him. Well, we had, on the 3rd floor of police headquarters, we had an office for the media. And we had Detroit news reporters actually working there on an 8-hour-a-day basis. That was their office. Well, also on the 3rd floor was the chief's office, and there was a press conference room set up specifically for news conferences. And the day before we caught him was the day that Chief Napoleon had to go in front of the media and explain to them that we've discovered these 3 bodies, that it's very apparent that Detroit has a serial killer working the west side, and basically telling the public what we knew at the time and what we thought they needed to watch out for. And so this is day 2, and he calls another press conference, and as we're all walking down the hallway to the 3rd floor press conference room, I hear one of the reporters say, hey, Chief, this is going to be a daily briefing on this case. It sounds like a big deal. And he looks at it and goes, nah, he says, I think this will be the last thing we talk about. Last time you hear about it. They kind of, all of them heard it. There were news people from the TV stations, and they're all setting up their cameras, and looked at him, kind of funny. And I'm watching their reaction because I knew what the press conference was all about. And sure enough, he starts the press conference. He introduces 2 uniformed officers from the 4th precinct, and he says, these are the guys that caught our serial killer last night. And all of a sudden, the lights came on. The newspaper people, the guy that asked him the question, knew he'd been had. And, you know, that he was now going to be the brunt of a joke after it was all over with. But it was kind of, the chief was happy. Obviously not happy because that you know, 3 more people were dead, but he was happy because we had acted fast enough and expeditiously enough that we were able to catch this guy within less than 48 hours and bring him in front of the, well, we didn't bring him in front of the media that day. We were still interrogating him, but he finally confessed to our 5, the one in Dearborn Heights, and 4 in Detroit. He also, we found out that he had been just discharged recently, a couple of years before that, from the U.S. Navy. He'd been assigned to the USS Nimitz, the aircraft carrier. And as he's spilling his soul to us about all of his evil deeds, he confessed to about 12 to 15 more that he had done wherever the Nimitz put into port, all over the world. He had been a global serial murderer. He had committed one, and he had killed one in Norfolk, Virginia when he was discharged from the Navy. We communicated with the Norfolk authorities and told them, you know, he confessed. If you want him, he's here. And they said, well, No, because, we were hoping they'd take it, because Virginia has a capital punishment. And we felt that that was probably more appropriate than anything you get in Michigan, no matter how many people he killed. But they told us, they said, no, if we take him, he says, the detective said, he says, he'll be appealing for 20 years. It's going to cost us several $100,000 in legal fees to keep him behind bars until they could finally put him to death. And, you guys got him, keep him. You got him for more than we got him for. We only had one, you got him for 5. And that was basically their attitude. We had the opportunity to interact with violent crime section, by the way, was a multi-agency task force. We were borderless. It was run by the city of Detroit, but it involved FBI agents, state police detectives, Wayne County Sheriff detectives, state attorney general investigators. We had a DEA agent, we had an IRS agent, we had a U.S. Marshal representative working out of the same office as with us, so that there was no crime committed in the city that we couldn't pursue, no matter where it took us. And we had a few of them that took us outside the city, in fact, outside the state, into several states. But in this one in particular, because we were dealing with the military, we had the real NCIS was assigned to our offices for about a month after we caught him. That was just the beginning of the job. We had to do an investigation to tie up all the loose ends and establish all of the evidentiary connections to this guy so that we can actually prosecute him, get him convicted. And then we had to verify all of the things that he confessed to, including all of his killings all over the world. So we had to have someone who could actually track the Nimitz travels for the years that he was assigned to it, and that was a little beyond our pay scale, even with our FBI agents working with us. And so we ended up with an NCIS agent assigned to us for about a month, and they had to work with the U.S. State Department in order to connect with all of these foreign law enforcement agencies in Taiwan and Hong Kong and Vietnam and wherever else he happened to be. And it was a really interesting investigation, at least for me to take part in. So as the boss, I had the liberty here. I took the liberty of copying the file. And I was sitting there for one weekend just going on the Xerox, like nobody's business. And the file was like that. I just put it in my briefcase and took it home, thinking, when I retire, I want to write a book. Well, as Billy Ray said, 20 years later, it still hadn't been written, but then I'd been working the whole time. It wouldn't have worked if I'd have tried to write it anyway. I am a researcher, and Billy Ray is a researcher also. She did an incredible job of going back, researching all of the details, finding all of the relatives of all of the victims, Michigan victims, and actually kind of bringing these women back to life. She got photos of them while they were still alive, and family photos and so on and so forth, which kind of, to a cop, you've got case files, you've got evidence scene photos. She made these victims, these statistics, real people. And that's kind of what led to our dilemma, because the company that we went to publish this thing was a textbook company. And they lauded her ability to do victimology, and they made this a partner book to a deviant psychology text. And I won't go into all the headaches that caused, but that's something I'll let Billy, expand on if she wants to. Any questions?
Yeah, we can take some
Sure.
questions.
This guy committed all these crimes in other countries. Some of those countries might have had a death penalty. Could you have asked another country, do you want him?
That was discussed, but these other countries seem to not take killing a hooker as seriously as we do in this country. They kind of looked at it as a public service more than a crime, to be perfectly honest and blunt. They went, yeah, so, you know.
And is he still in prison?
Yes, he is. He's still alive. He's in prison. I understand.
He's in the G. Robert Cotton facility in Jackson. Yeah.
I mean, for life?
Yes,
Forever,
definitely
yeah.
multiple life sentences. Yeah, he's been there about 20 years.
Yep, he's been there ever since. He's a permanent resident of the
Yeah.
state of Michigan. He's, according to correctional statistics, it costs you, the taxpayer, roughly $45,000 a year to keep him alive.
Oh, is he?
He's only turning 50 this December. He was incarcerated, well, he was arrested when he was 26, so he's a pretty young guy, and he's turning 50 this year.
What year did all this occur?
He moved to Michigan with his wife to Dearborn Heights in 1999 and started attacking people. The thing is, he was known to have killed 5 in Detroit, but he also attacked 5 people who survived. So he attacked 10 people altogether in Detroit. And the first person he attacked who survived was in August of 1999. He had moved back to Michigan with his wife in like the spring, April, May. And then once he had been here a couple months, then evidently, you know.
Is he the same one attached to the Dearborn Heights murder too?
Yes, yes, it's all one case. Yep.
There's an interesting aspect to that, too. The sergeant from Dearborn Heights actually had DNA from him that matched him to the first killing, but a Wayne County prosecutor refused to sign the warrant for his arrest until they had the paperwork from the Michigan